Welcome to Dissecting Neural Networks Filter Responses for Artistic Style Transfer. Before we start into this topic, there is a spoiler alert for the next session, because you can try it out yourself. If you go to this link in orange, evostart.florianuhde.com, you can upload an image and get it pre-processed. And because it takes a while, I'm just putting this out right now so you can get a head start from everyone else. Okay, back to topic. So my name is Florian Uhde. I'm a software engineer, which means that if I have to do something that would take me an hour to do, I would spend at least 2 hours trying to automate it, which is kind of why this paper came to be. I do have a passion for computation and creativity. I'm deeply interested in systemic designs, and my background is in the games industry or visualization in general, and also nature-inspired computing. And for this presentation, before we go into the topic itself, we're going to do a very small detour into neural artistic style transfer. I guess most of you already know what this is, but still I just want to touch on the basics so that we have a common understanding here. So for this, the core idea is that you have two images, let's call them A and B, and you want to instruct the program to draw you image A in the style of image B. So basically, we're trying to get the content of image A rendered in the style of image B. And the place where the neural comes into play is that we do this by using a neural network. So we take not any neural network, but one that was pre-trained on image detection usually, because the assumption is that in the filters of the neural network that you see scribbled as those tiny boxes here, there is some information about structures and concepts of the image that it was trained on. And the way it works is you pass your images through the neural network, you look at the filter responses, and then you build up some loss functions for content, some loss function for style, and you optimize your resulting image to minimize this loss. The technique is not super new. It gained quite a bit of traction in 2015, I think, after a paper by Gattis et al. That proved that it is able of producing visually very interesting results. And the way they did it is they handpicked certain layers in a pre-trained neural network that worked very well for paintings. With a problem, I think we heard it again in the first session, that it's not working quite well on other use cases. So especially on images where you have like constrained objects like architecture or cars or something that rely on a very specific composition of elements, it is working not so well. And because this was something I was working with, the idea or the question for this work was, is there a better way of picking those layers to use instead of trying them over and over again and running it on your crappy laptop to see what comes out of this? And the concept that we take for this is that instead of assuming that we have an image A and an image B, we now have a class of images A. So we have multiple images of type A, multiple images of type B. Those are our training data set, if you want so. And what we can do by having a lot of images is we can pass them all through this neural network and record how the filters activate on a class of images. So you see it in the scribbles again. A blue plus, for example, would mean that this specific filter activates very highly on each image of class A. A yellow minus, for example, would mean that this filter does not activate at all on images from class B. And then we do have filters which do not really show any remarkable activation level on any class. But what we can do if we have this is we can kind of figure out some classes and assign each filter into one of those classes. And the first class to look at are significant filters. So those are filters that activate consistently over all images of a single class. So the first one in the top row with a blue plus would be a filter that for each image in class A, in the class A training data set, it would have a high activation level. And we figure this out by looking at the variance of the filter between all the images of a single class. And then we just have some kind of threshold, and every filter that is below this threshold in the variance can be considered significant. And we can do a further separation of those by saying, okay, we have disjoint filters, which are filters that only activate on one of our training classes. And we do have intersecting filters that activate on both of the classes with a significant consistency. And one thing to note, if you look at the yellow filter right in the center, we can have intersecting filters that have different levels of activation. So the one in the center would activate strongly on images of class A and would not activate on images of class B. And this brings us to the second class of filters, which are diversifying filters, which are filters that do have a high variance between the classes. So now we are looking at filters that do have different activation levels between the two classes. Like the one in the center we just talked about is like a prime example of this. But we could also have a filter that only activates on class A with a strong activation and not so much on class B. So we do have different levels of diversity here. And to pick those, we again calculate the variance between the two classes and then just select the n strongest filters here. And given those classes, what we can do, or what I did, is like sort the filters into different semantic types. So I draw a Venn-like diagram here with the classes. So to recap, green and yellow are significant filters, with green only being significant for one class, yellow for both, and blue are the diversifying filters. And we can now kind of figure out interesting properties of those filters. So type number one would mean that the filter encapsulates a feature that is only very important in one of our images. Number two would be something that encapsulates a feature that is either very important in both classes or not important at all in both classes. So something that does not appear in any of those images as much as we would need for significance. And then we do have number four, which is similar to two. So we do have a feature in here that is significant for both classes, but with an opposing activation level. So that would mean if it's activating strongly for class A, it would not activate for class B, or vice versa. And number three is like a weaker version of four. So we still have a feature that activates strongly on class A and not so strong on class B, for example, but it would only be significant for one of the two classes. And the idea now was to like figure out, after classifying those filters, which of the filters are interested for our content loss and our style loss. And I plotted the boxes here. So the red box is interesting for content loss, because for content loss, we're trying to create a resulting image that contains specific elements from our image A, but that does not necessarily contain elements from image B. So what we're trying to achieve is we are looking for filters that can tell us about features that exist in one of the classes, but not in the other. So this is why we're mostly interested in the diversifying filters in purple. And then filters of type 4 are, of course, extremely interesting because they specifically tell us about features that exist in one of the classes but do not exist in the other classes. And 3 is also interesting, but does have a little bit smaller information density in it. And for the style loss, we're looking to kind of intrinsically build up a mapping function to transfer elements of image B onto elements of image A. So we're here interested in intersecting filters that allow us to build some kind of mapping between the two classes of images that we have. So this is the case for filters of type 2 and type 4, because those are the filters that contain some kind of mappable information for us. And then I run some experiments. So this was started during my PhD program at Volkswagen. This is why we had this Volkswagen Beetles on the one hand from the Stanford car data set, and leopards on the other side from the open image data set. And idea was to render an image of a beetle with a nice texture of a leopard, because I assume that's what everyone wants to drive. And by putting all those images through the VGG19 network, I was able to just gather some kind of statistics. So on the right side, you see a table showing for each layer of the network how many of the filters belong to a certain class in percentages. Layers which had less than 1% contribution are not shown here to save some space. But if we apply this, this loss interest that we just talked about, we see that we do have, for content loss, where we are interested in the diversifying layers, we do have a few layers that have a high percentage of diversifying filters. So those are the ones that we would like to pick for our content loss function. And for style loss, we're looking for intersecting filters. So we do have a few layers here that have a very high percentage of intersecting filters. So those are the layers that are interesting for style loss function. And to like give you a bit of hands-on idea what we're talking about, this is kind of a rendering of what those filters activate on. So I took the top 4 type 4 filters and kind of reconstructed what would have a high activation value on them. So to recall, type 4 were features that are very dominant in one of the images, but not so dominant or not dominant at all in the other class. And we see that we do have these patterns that are quite common on leopards, not so common on cars usually. And with some creative thinking, I guess this could be like some bubbly, bloated curves, which are very typical for this round model of the VW Beetle, but don't really occur in natural imagery so much. And to like close the loop, the thing that you would do is when you want to run artistic style transfer with this, you would take all this information that we just talked about, and then automatically pick the layers that have a high information density. So what is plotted here is, again, all the layers with the count of type 3 and 4 filters summed up and normalized, as well as 2 and 4. And we do see that we have some layers that have a higher coefficient than others, which maps to the table that we just marked in the table. And so we would automatically pick those layers and use them for our loss functions. And doing this, I do have an example here of a content image, which is a car, a style image which is leopard, and then this is the vanilla style transfer using the layers and the weights from the Gates paper. And this is the same loss functions, just using the filters picked by the algorithm. And you can see that they are quite similar in the quality of the result. You see that there is a little bit less bleeding of textures in the lower part. And the explanation for this would be that by picking the filters that convey a lot of information between the images, we're able to find specific elements that we would like to exclude. So we get a little bit more semantic information about the objects that we're looking at. Of course, this is just like a starting point, and there needs to be a lot more validation to be done, but it is an automatic way of filter selection, which can be tested upon other classes of images. The downside is that you do require training data to pre-process before you can do your style transfer. And of course, like with most machine learning applications, the results you get are only going to be as good as the training data that you have. And one thing that is currently the case that could be expanded upon is that we still operate on layer level. So we use the information about the interesting filters to figure out what layer in the network to pick. It would also be possible to just straight away only pick the filters that we are interested in. So to get a bit more fine-grained control, basically, but not in this work because I wanted it to be kind of comparable to the default way of doing it. And for some future work that I'm investing in is first that the look of how much scaling the image during the process would influence the result, because something that I could also imagine being helpful is when you start out on a broader scale, transferring over main elements, and then maybe move over to some more classical style transfer works to add in the details of the textures and the force. Another point is that currently the algorithm is treating positive and negative activation. So having a lot of activation versus no activation with the same weight. And the question would be, as we are trying to generate something, it might be interesting to only focus on positive activations, because those positive activation in the end tell us what an object is versus what an object is not. So that is something to be tried out if this has any influence and if it's a desirable influence on the result. And the last point, so many generative techniques have moved from things like style transfer into the realm of generative adversarial networks, for example, so to have other creational methods underlying the process. And that would also be something to be investigate further if the approach used here could also have a positive influence on other creative generative methods. And that brings us to the reference of the images and networks named in this presentation. And now I would be very happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Florian, for your presentation. Yes, questions, please. Does anyone have a question? Perhaps you can use the chat if you prefer not to talk. Well, meanwhile, sorry, I was interrupting João Cunha. Go ahead.
I was curious to see other examples. Do you only train this on the Volkswagen and the Leopard, or do you have other images? Because it would be, I think it's very interesting, the results that you're obtaining and focusing on this positive activation. I think it's very interesting to actually, I work in visual blending, so I can more or less see this as very interesting. But I was curious to see other examples, because the images that you saw, and I'm also peeking at the paper, it's only focused on the Leopard. So I was curious to ask you if you have used or at least tested on other images.
So I did also some like more complete runs on car data that was used within VW, where I did the PhD. Unfortunately, this is not public for sharing, so can't put this out. I have been running it on different like cars versus other classes from open image dataset, but of course the Leopard is kind of handpicked for the presentation because it was the one that looked the best. General thing is it seems to work quite well. It is not magnitudes better than classical style transfer. I also have to say this. So you're not going to, with an image that is completely broken in style transfer, you're most likely not going to fix it completely with this result. It tends to it tends to produce a bit better results for complex cases like architecture and cars, combined with more organic cases like the Leopard. So as long as you have diverse filter activation in both classes, you will get a slight edge by using this this algorithm. For classical cases, it tends to pick layers that are very close to the layers that are also used in the classical style transfer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question and of course for the answer. I was curious to ask you, Florian, or at least I didn't get that information. Have you tried already to automate in any way the selection of the filters? I know you mentioned something in the conclusions about it, or is something that you pretend or you want to experiment in the future, like the filters could be selected using, for example, a search algorithm or something like that?
So the process right now is running completely autonomous. So you just provided a link to like, this is my class A data, this is my class B data. And then it completely runs the pipeline in an autonomous way. What I mentioned in the Outlook is right now I do select those filters and sort them into the classes. And then I like do another step of figuring out which layer contains the most of my interesting filters. And then I use this layer for the style transfer.
Yes, so it's like a selection for each class. It's dependent on the class, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I look for the interesting filters based on class 3 and 4 and 2 and 4, and then I pick the layer with the highest contribution of those filters. But an extension would be to have a different loss function that is not working on layer basis, but instead is able to take in the filters directly and like kick out the step of picking the layers with the highest contribution.
Okay, but like if I, for example, if I wanted to experiment with another class of images, for example, motorcycles or something like that, the filter selection is also automatically picked by that score that you talked about. Okay, so it's not handmade or hand selected, but it's also the same criteria, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So you just provide different input data, and then it will run on its own and give you the same result. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you, Florian.